All right, welcome everyone today. So we're just gonna be basically reviewing like next week work. I uh, I I noticed on Friday we had like I think over like a 50% attendance. So for the sake of the majority of people who were in there on Friday, I'm just gonna go over like the things we did on Friday, and then we'll move on to the next thing. So um, as you've been following up, we've been building like the API for Kigali Public Library, and we've been working on like the basic CRUD functionalities. For those of you who weren't there on Friday, just a recap of what we did. So we worked on like the very basic the basic things, right? So we worked on the CRUD functionalities. So where you create a book, right? You get all the books in the database. You get a single book in the database, and you update a book and you delete a book, right? And we also talked about like also things like middlewares, right? And error handling. All right. To create a book, right? We said you would make a new instance of the model, right? In this case, which is our book model. And if you look at this, this is coming from book, right? So I probably would have to like rename this, do like the renaming properly. But yeah, this is coming from our book model, right? So to create a book, we make a new instance of that book, right? And we call the dot our save method on this, right? All right. To get a single book, right? We can say we could to get all the books in the database, right? We can call this or either pass this with an empty object, right? Because there's no query in it. We want everything, right? And then yeah, to get one book, right? We in this case we talked about like the two queries we could either use. So we could usually like outside mongoose, right? Would use like the find, right? Find or find one, right? And then we'll pass in like the ID. So we could do something in here like this. We could say something like this. Await book that find one, right? And in here the underscore ID. Remember we said the underscore ID uniquely identifies each document in the collection, right? So request dot params dot ID, right? And this will be totally valid, right? So but mongoose also has like a nice like abstraction over this used by called find by id, right? So we're just passing like the id as a string, and the id is coming in as a request parameter, right? And then we use that to find like a single record, right? All right. And then we also talked about like updating like a book, right? Updating like a book in the record and all of that. All right. And also deleting a book. All right. So we're gonna make like a few adjustments to this, and so how this is gonna go is I'm gonna put like for every new feature we work on, or every day, every new thing we add, I'm gonna put this on a different branch so you can actually like see and track like the progress, right? So So today we've done like a review of a code review. The last thing we were talking about on Friday before we ended the day was we're talking about like error handling in your applications, right? So errors are like a natural part of your applications, right? Either user defined errors or errors from the servers, or they're a very natural part of your application, right? So you have to like handle like errors properly, right? So in our case, if you remember from like the very first method we were working with, right, we will have a try or we'll have a catch, and if there's an error, we would say in here we would put rest dot maybe for example, if for example maybe we couldn't update this book, for example, we would say rest dot status, rest the status, right? We give like the error, maybe we give the error maybe 400 or something, right? And then and then um and then we I'm still getting used to the travel on this other laptop, so I give my lot of typos, and then we give like the error, right? So we say but we saw like we're repeating ourselves all the time and just lots of try catches all over here. And instead we had like a global middleware, right, that handles all our errors, right? So and if you look in here, we this is the what we find is our error as an error handler, and we say like the error middleware has like four arguments to the callback function, right? So the first one is like the error object, the second, then the standard request response next, and we also say that your error middleware should be like the last middleware in your stack, right? Because that's the last thing that gets handled, right? So if you put like this error middleware maybe first, this won't work. This won't work, right? So it has to be the, because errors are the last thing that get bubbled up like at the end of the stack of you. So you have to keep them as the last middleware. So yeah, all right. So today we're gonna improve like on this error handling we're talking about, right? So if I save this, I'm just gonna save all, save all, control KS, so control KS. Okay, I'm still getting used to this keyboard. All right, control K. All right, I'm just gonna click save all. All right, so let's start up our server. We're gonna start this up with node server server.js. Right. All right. So we have our server listening on port 3000. So I'm going to talk about like something very useful that we would find useful, right? First, before we start this. So in here I have like a workspace, right? A Postman workspace. So I'm going to show you something called Postman Variables, and I just want us to keep documenting the API as we're building rather than co- coming back to common like, yeah. So and we can also share like this among like everyone like in the entire cohort. So so in here I'm just gonna delete this. I'm gonna delete this first to show you. Yep. All right. So Postman, like in a Postman collection, like for example, if you're having like a group of API, right? Like an API in this our case, like the library API, you would create a collection for that API, and all the requests would be in that collection, right? So to create if you have you can create like a workspace, right? And I created this as a public workspace, so I can share it with you guys. All right. So you can create a collection, right? When you add here, it will tell you a new collection, right? So let's just edit the collection name. Use my mouse. All right. So that's, yeah, this is way more convenient. All right. We're gonna edit the collection and call this Kigali Kigali public Kigali public library 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 API. All right. So the main thing I want to show you today is as from on this is something called Postman Variables. So usually when we want to make a request to our API, right? We will new request. We will come here. The request will enter maybe I would say localhost, right? 300 books, right? And we will send like this request, right? And that works, right? But the problem with this is that now we are developing on our PC, right? There would be a time where we'd have to like push this on a server, and we can't be using localhost again, right? So instead of hard coding this, the whole concept, just like the concept of variables in your programming, right? You can also make variables in Postman, right? So to make a variable in Postman, you would come to when you create, you will come to the collection, right? So you come to this tab called variables, right? So we're going to create a variable. So instead of us referring to localhost, right, all the time. Instead, we're just gonna, we're in this place, we're just gonna call this maybe we're gonna call this something called, maybe let's say backend. All right, we can call it host, right? We can call it maybe host, right? We can call it host, right? So we can give it like a current value of HTTP, right? HTTP localhost uh 3000, right? So in future this might change when we start, maybe when we put this thing on the server, right? So this won't be localhost again. This URL will now be referring to like our server online, right? So you can see now I persist you when you're done that to save like the variable, you persist all. So this will it would be in the initial value and all of this, right? It would be in the current value and initial value, right? So when we come here now, instead of us calling localhost by hand, by hard coding localhost here, we can just simply reference this way, and then we can call this a host, right? So and um, let's just to be sure I did this correctly. Yep, localhost 3000, and yep, and this should refer, what's the name I gave to it, host. All right, and okay, persist all. All right, so I think, yeah, I have to save this. Yeah, so when I save this now, you can see if I hover over this, it refers to like localhost, right? So now if I send, I don't have to hard code localhost. So for example, if I change the port, if we come here and we change the port from 3000 to say, let's say 3001, right? Let's kill our server and we start again, right? So instead of me now to go and change every request I make to 3001, I can just come to this variable, right? And just change it to 3001, right? Persist all, I'm just gonna save it, and then I send my request. So that makes our life like super easy, right? All right. So another thing we're gonna do is we're gonna divide this thing into domains, right? So in our application, right, we already we made like, and we're fully fleshing everything out, right? It will take it would, we're in the process, right? But we said like the main entities in this, in when we're building like this library, is like the users of the library, right? People that would come to the library, right? The users, the books in the library, and the administrators of the libraries. This could be like the librarians, all the staffs working in the library, right? So we're gonna use like the same we're gonna basically, the way you would create like all this respective, like maybe in your models you have a book, right? You would have a user and you have like an admin. We will take like the same thing here, right? So because now we said we're working on just the book, I'm going to be working on just the book part, and then you guys will do the other part. All right. So I'm going to delete this. I'm going to delete this particular request, and instead I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something called I'm going to create a folder, right? Inside this folder, I'm going to call this folder I'm going to call this folder books, right? All right. So now all the API requests related to books, I'm gonna keep them here, right? So you see how like this is becoming more organized, right? All right. So let's call for every API. So let's call like the create. Let's call this create create a book, right? Create a book, right? And now the URL. Remember we defined like the variables in Postman, so we can easily just do this and call this the host, right? Right, and then we can say API slash books, right? And to create a book, we send like a post request, right? All right. So in here, we're gonna say raw, and then we're gonna JSON, right? All right. So cool. So now to create a book, what did we say we needed? We needed like the name of the book, right? So let's just call this what's the name of this Chinomanda's book? Purple hibiscus, right? We can say purple hibiscus, right? The name of the book. What's the next thing? So we go to the book. a book author, the ISBN, and the category, right? And we're gonna that this schema is gonna change over time. But let's just work with this. So author would be would be Chimamanda Adichie, right? Uh, Chimamanda Adichie, right? Say the ISBN, and this ISBN. I think for uniformity, we should probably change that to like a small case. So this could be like just give it like some random number. I don't know what the ISBN looks like, and then and what the next thing, category. And we said category is a string. This will change, but for now, let's just work with that. All right. So call this category. All right. Category, and let's call this I don't know, Afro fiction. All right. So now we can just send this as a post request. Let's say this is on. All right. And yeah, so it's API slash slash v1, right? Yep, just API slash v1, right? All right. So we could even create like for example, we could create like when we start having multiple versions of the API, right? We could, instead of this whole thing here, we could just we could take this yep, we could actually take this. Okay, you know what? Let's go and edit this variable, and let's not call it host. Let's call this API. We could call this, for example, the API path, like the path to the API, right? We could, instead of putting just localhost here, we could just put localhost API and v1, right? But this is, so for now, let's not just go ahead of ourselves. This is totally fine. Let's just continue working with this. So API v1. So now if we send so we have localhost, right, slash API slash v1, right? All right, yeah. Now this makes sense. At least we're hitting the API and we're getting an error, right? All right, so all right, so in our, so let's go to like the create one, the create one and the create one the create one all right, so that was a weird error, but yeah, I figured out what was going on. So so basically, and this is where we would get to we would get to we'll get to this is like a precursor to what we're going to write. So the next thing we're going to talk about like is error handling, right? So we stopped we started on this on Friday, and then we stopped somewhere, right? We stopped like halfway. So basically right now what was happening was that error, like there's some there's some there's basically in here, right? This is first things first. I should take that out. Yeah, but basically what was happening was that every like error coming from like Mongoose, right, has like a specific code, and we will take advantage of that in our code, right? But in that case, in here I'm checking like if error.code exists, right? We should use the error.code, else we should use 500. But this error.code that was coming in is a code from Mongoose, which is in the range of 79, and there's no HTTP status response status code that's in the range of 79, right? So that threw in an error, and you can see it says range error, error HTTP invalid status code, right? So yeah, that was basically it. So but we would get to that, and how you would design like a proper error handling. So for now, let's just say for every error we have in an application, right, we return 500, right, in this error middleware, right? And for those of you who weren't there on Friday, I'm just gonna pull this error, middlewares in Express, right? Just this is like the official documentation, right? um, yeah, error handling, right? Error handling middleware, right? So when you pass in like four arguments into this, right, the first argument is the error, and then we have the request, the response, and the next, right? So you have access to the error object in here, right? All right, so this is it, right? So error handling argument takes in four, error handling middleware takes in four arguments. Yeah, so, and you also, to specify this as an error handler, you have to like give like four arguments, right? All right. So so now that we have a central middleware that handles all our error, um what's the next thing we have to do, right? So the next thing we have to do is, remember, like I say, that we're gonna install like a library. We're gonna install this library called HTTP errors. First, we're gonna install this library called HTTP errors that allows us just, all right, you could decide to write like a class for this, but there's a library that does this, right? So it allows you create HTTP errors, and you can see this has like all like the popular HTTP errors. You have like the bad request, unauthorized, and all of this, and forbidden, not found. All right. So yeah. So we already installed this library on Friday. If you check our package.json, we have it in here, HTTP errors, right? So now we're gonna take advantage of this library. We're gonna take advantage of this library in here, right? Okay. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna so just let me clear my console. All right. We start up a server, right? So back in here, let's try and create like a, so, and remember I told you that MongoDB does something called MongoDB, until like a database connection is established, right? You can do anything. So Mongoose handles all of that. So Mongoose kind of like um buffers, So if you're trying to make a request, when did not Mongoose hasn't established like a connection to the database, you would wait. So that's why you see, like, if we don't wait for a connection to the database, um we the request like takes longer, right? So now we've created like our document, right? So we're success true, and then we have data. And I said I'm gonna put like a document on this on Slack that shows like basically like there's some like kind of like standardized like formats for like returning data from RESTful APIs. All right, I'm gonna just put a document on Slack, so you should check your Slack for that. All right, so so data, right? We've created like this document, right? So it's been created. So that's for our post create a book, right? And if there's an error, this just next it and forwards it and forwards it down, right, to our error middleware, which then handles it. All right. So to demonstrate this now, I'm gonna use I'm gonna use we're gonna go to like the get one book, right? Now, in the scenario where, like in our case, right? So let's just test all the APIs. So let's call this, let's create another request. let's create another request and let's call this get 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 all books, right? All right, so same thing as before. uh, get all books. So we could probably even put all of this into a variable, right? So for example, we could abstract this v1 into a variable. So if we're having like multiple versions of the API, we can just simply change like the version number. But we're just gonna hard code this for now. All right. So this is gonna get all books in the at the API, and this is gonna be a get request, right? And if we send this, this would give us like an array of all the books in the API, right? And also we did like a count thing that would this is an array, so we can just return array.length, and it gives us like a length of all the arrays in the API in the of all an arrays of all the documents in that collection. All right. So let's say let's call the next one. We're just gonna add another request. We're gonna say I'm gonna call this create get one book, right? Get one book or get a single book. Get one book. All right. So in here, same thing. Now this time we're gonna give the ID of the book, right? So we can just come here and should be here. Chimamanda's book we created. Let's pick one of the object ID for the Chimamanda's book, right? And we pass it here as a parameter, right? All right. So and then yeah. So we remember I said a get request shouldn't have a body. So you don't get request do not have a body, right? If you want a body, you should use like a post route. So that's just following like the rest architectural principles. So if we send this now, this would give us like a single thing, right? So now this is where we're gonna test out our error handling. So let's say I mess up this. So this thing here, this thing, right? This underscore ID is something called an object ID, right? So an object ID, we say it's like uniquely, an ID uniquely identifies each document in the database, right? And so object ID might look like a string, right? You can convert it directly into string, but it's not a string. Like it's a special data type that MongoDB uses, right? So it's you can see this is it. It's a 4 byte whatever. You can just read this up, right? And it has like a specific length, right? and uh and specific characteristic, right? And you can create new ones on your own. Like you can import like the object ID object from like mongoose or even the native mongodb JS mongodb client and make yours, right? But now let's say in our example we mess up like we add some extra characters, right? So we add some extra characters. Let's say um, this some extra characters to the object ID, and we send this request, right? We get an error, right? And let's go to our error middleware, right? We get an error, right? And we can just to make this let's console.log error, right? So we can actually see the error on our on our um on our console, right? Right. So let's just so our life will be easier. Let's just wait until Mongoose is established, until we've established the database connection. And if you remember, we're doing this from the root of the project, right? In here, we just do like a Mongoose connect, and if it's been connected, this returns a promise, right? So if it's been connected, we just console like log connected to the database. Else, we catch any errors, and when we log the error. All right. So so yeah, let's make a request. Now we've made a request with a bad object ID, and let's do this again. And you can see like the error, right? So it says the error says cast error, cast the object ID field for value. For value gives like the value, right? So if you see this, like this, an object ID is like the string, like it has to like follow like some certain rules, right? So if you mess up this object ID and all this thing, and MongoDB is unable to like Mongoose is unable to convert this into like a valid object ID to like query the database with, you would get an error, right? So now in our middleware, we can handle like all kind of errors we have, right? So imagine you send this error to like a front-end developer, right? It doesn't really make sense to if you're a front-end developer or any other person querying like this API using this API, this doesn't really make sense, right? You want to give like more descriptive errors to whoever is using your API, right? So so we're gonna go to like our error and our error middleware and do something. That's the first case we wanna talk about, and then the second case is let's say we give a valid object ID, but let's go to Compass, right? Let's go to MongoDB Atlas. Let me MongoDB Atlas. Right. Let me connect to the database. All right. I want to connect to. Okay. I don't have. Let's see. This is gonna work because it might depend. All right. Yeah. We're connected to our database now. Mm. So yeah. So we're using our test database, right? And in here we have like we have a couple of we have a couple of books, right? So let's say for the particular book we're trying to get, this particular book, right? Let's make it back a valid object ID and we can test this. And now we can get this book, right? Let's delete this particular book from the database, right? Right. Let's go and the same. So the syntax, the syntax for querying. And remember, I told you like object ID is a is a is a it's not just an ordinary string, it's a specific type of string, right? So like we just saw like the characteristics of it's a hexadecimal. So it's not just a regular string, right? So even in when you're using Compass, you have to convert this into an object ID, right? So Mongoose does that for you under the hood, but you have when you're using Compass, you have to convert this into an object ID, right? All right. So and the same queries you use like for querying, and we saw this when we did like the introduction to MongoDB, right? So the same queries also apply in here, right? So in here I'm simply looking for a document that has this underscore document where the underscore ID field equals to the object ID of the string, right? So I can find this and this would give me like the specific document. All right, so I'm gonna delete this from the database. Right now this is deleted. All right, so now, if I make a get request again to fetch this particular record from the database, we know what we're gonna expect, right? We're gonna expect that this is not gonna work, right? And that's what's gonna happen, right? This is not gonna work, right? So because we won't be able to find this particular document in the database. We've deleted it from Compass, right? So if we send, right, it says like no book with this ID found, right? But if you look at the error code we're getting, says internal server error, which is not the right response code, right? So we need to like be able to like configure our error middleware to be able to like give us like depending on like the kind of error we're dealing with, right? To be able to give us like they'll be able to give us different error code and different like the right messages and all of that. All right, so yeah, so now let's start handling that. So let's start with the first case. In the first case, you see that we saw that right, we saw that it says what, cast error, right? Cast the object ID failed for value this, right? So in our error middleware, right, we can so if it's a cast error, means that the issue is from like our user, right? Or whoever is querying our API, that they didn't give us like a correct MongoDB, they didn't give us like a correct MongoDB a MongoDB object ID, right? So we could define like a variable. Okay, we're just gonna leave like the console that we could define a variable called error. An error is gonna be like an empty object, right? All right. So in here, this is where this error is the place where we're gonna put like our what's it called? We're gonna put like our our main error, right? So if you notice, so all errors have like some specific like properties, like especially errors from MongoDB, for example, have like a name property, like and a code. So we can actually go, we can just go to the Mongoose documentation, very specific. So we're gonna say Mongoose errors, right? And just see all the type of errors you would find like in Mongoose, right? So in Mongoose, there are a couple of errors. We have your cast error, you have your divergent document not found error, and all a couple of errors, right? Validation errors. So now, depending on what the user was trying to do, right, the error can change. And the kind of message, we want to give like a more descriptive message to the user and want to give like return like the right status code, right? So so now we can check and say so the first thing we can do is we can check here and we can say we can check and say, so if we console, I'm going to show you something, and let's take up, we're going to take out this first, right? I'm going to console.log error dot name, not error, a air, this other short error, right? So back to Postman, I'm going to mess up the object ID again, right? Just wait a few seconds for us to establish a connection to our database, and then I'm going to send this, right? So if we come back to our console, right, the name is cast error. So we can check like based off the name of the error, we can decide on how we want to handle the error, right? So in this case now, we're gonna say in this case now we can check and say if error dot name right equals to a cast error, right? A cast error, right? So we're gonna paste this here. So I don't miss the control. If it equals to cast error, right, we know like a cast error is the issue is from the client or whoever is querying our API, right? They give us they gave us like a bad what's it called, a bad MongoDB object ID, right? So we can say now our error, right, equals to, we can also in here we can just do something, we can just we can say our error equals to in here. So this is where like that HTTP error library comes in, right? So can require like that HTTP require right HTTP errors, right? And we can say so this is a bad request, right? You gave us a bad object you gave us a bad object ID, right? So we can say this error equals to new, we'd make a new instance of this bad request, right? And so this takes in like the message, right? So the message we want to give us wants to say we can say, for example, invalid just a small invalid invalid object id provided, right? Invalid object id provided, right? So in here now, in here now we can check, because now when you make a new instance of this error, right? So when you make a new, let's go back to this. Yeah, actually, it's VS Code can help us with that. So this does like a 400, right? So now this error thing, now you have a couple of, let's go back to the documentation for this, and you should get comfortable with like looking at documentations, because that's your first source of truth, right? So if you come here now, there are a couple of properties that exist on this any error object you create with this library, right? So you have like a status, and you'll have like a message, right? So you can see this error properties. You have a message, you have a status, and you have a status code. So the both of them are the same thing. So the status code, error mirroring. So you can decide to write like for example a class for this and make a new instance of the class, if you want to do that. But I prefer like just use like a library that, it's a very simple library, so you can actually look through like the source code and see like and see like uh all the implementation, right? All right, so so in here now, if I'm just gonna say, so in here now I can now check, instead of using error, now we want to use like this new error object we created right now. Yeah, right. So so we can spread, remember the spread operator, right? So now we want to first, we don't want to modify or play with the main error object coming from the main error stack coming from our application, right? We just want to like put this into a new object. So we can put this into, spread this into a new object. So we make a copy of this in here, right? So now we can check like if it has a error, that if it has a name of cast error, now we want to change it to something more readable, right? We can say new invalid object ID provided, right? You can make it as descriptive as you want, right? All right. So in here, instead we would reference error dot message. Remember from the library, there's certain properties all instance of this, of anything you make from this library has, right? All right. So and in here we can also reference like the error dot status or status code, anyone you want, right? It's the same thing, right? So for now, let's just do this. Now this is not, we're working towards like an optimal thing, but let's just do this, right? So now if we send a request again, right? Now this gives us this tells us, oh, you made a bad request, the success was false, and invalid object ID provided, right? This is more descriptive to whoever is using our API. They can know, okay, now, oh, the issue is with my object ID, I want to go change it, right? All right. So you shouldn't just send like application errors directly to the client, right? You should try as much as possible and account for like, think of all the possible errors that could happen in your application, and yeah, account for all of them. All right. So that's the first thing. That's the first kind of error. All right. So um so one thing here we can do is, for example, if the error doesn't have a status code, maybe it's an error that's a default error like we didn't care to handle, we can just give it the default of 500, right? So this is, if you remember from like the basic JavaScript run through we did. So this is a or operator, right? Right, we have there's the and like this, and then there's the or like this, right? So which of them, if this evaluates to true, right? So if error the status evaluate to true, right, that would be used. If it doesn't, 500 will be used, right? So we just give it a default error. All right. So That's the very first thing. So now we've handled like the case of if it's a cast error, we just give like a new instance of a yeah. Now the second case is what if, remember we deleted like this particular record from the database, right? So now if we send an error, right, right, if we send an error, right, we get like a so I'm gonna use this instead just to make our lives easier. Let's use status code because I don't think any of the object will have the status code will be undefined. If you look at the documentation, so it's the same thing. We are working towards an optimal solution. So if we go back here, if you look at the properties of the errors, so yep, the status mirrors the status code, right? So the status code is the main object and the status just mirrors it, right? So I would prefer we just use like the main one, right? All right, so so right, all right, so back in here, first thing we put the console log, the log like the error, right? All right, yeah, still buffering. All right, so if we go back to our controllers, right? So we say the if not book, we throw like we throw like a we throw like an error, right? And we say if the book doesn't exist, right, we throw an error like this no book with this ID found, right? So we should have access. So this error object should also, if I'm not mistaken, this also should have a message. It should also have a message because we're simply just copying the error into this. So mm, at anyways, so back to what we were doing. So I'm just gonna log the error here, and so I'm just gonna before. So basically, we're trying to make an object, right, and then spread this error in here, right? Uh, so we can do like a shallow copy. So you can also read up on that. So basically there's several ways in JavaScript you can make a copy of an object, right? So if you want to remember, we talked about like um, basically values in we talked about like referencing by what's it called again? Like when you're dealing with primitives, right? You can make when you reference, you can make like a copy. But when you're dealing with like other like data types like objects, you're actually referencing like the original, like the like the actual value in memory, right? So we don't want to change like this is the original error object that's coming from an application. So if you see here, like in this case, we are modifying like the object. So what the error object? So we don't want to do that, right? We want to make a copy and work with that copy. So that's what I'm trying to do here, right? So apparently, now if I console.log this, right? Because you would copy and you know about this the JavaScript spread operator, right? So and I send like uh uh I sent like a request, right? And if you look at this, if I just go to the end of my No, I don't want to console the log this. I don't want to console the log this. I want to console the log this. Right. You're gonna see it's the last thing here. It's an empty object. So for some reason, you can't make a copy of the original error object using like this using like the spread operator. But another way you can make a copy, and this works, another way is something called object assigned, and we can open like the documentation for this and see how it works. So we can say object dot assign, and this should open the the MDN, yep, the MDN documentation, right? So you can make copies of all enumerable own properties from one source. Yep, basically we have a target and we have a source, right? So when we make a copy of this, now you look at the new object, right? So if you put, for example, in this case, if you put like an empty object in here, right, it would copy everything from the target into the source. So we can use that. That's another trick we can use to copy things. So I'm going to use that in here. I'm going to say object.assign, right? And we're going to use like the original error object that's coming from JavaScript as our and then we're going to use an empty object. So this will copy everything into an empty object, and we assigned it to this error. So this way now we don't have to like modify. We don't have to modify our original error object, right? So now if I send a request again this time, right? If I send a request again this time, right, and we console the log error, you see it copied all like the properties of error into this error object, and we can work with this now. All right. So I'm gonna go back to login now. Depending on like what you want, you might want to log like the entire error stack, or you might just want to log only maybe like the error.message. So that's up to you. That the preference is yours, but I would prefer, especially in development, you want to log like the entire thing, so you see what's really going on. All right. So we've handled like the case for when you don't give us an object ID. Now let's go to in this other case where you give us we make a request with object ID that does not exist, right? If we go to our controllers here, in here on Friday we throw like an just a regular error object, right? And that's fine. But if you look at the status code, right, for this, this gives us an internal server error, right? But usually this shouldn't be the case, right? Because we should get like the resource the person is trying to look for doesn't exist, right? So we should get like say for example we should get like a not found, right? All right, so we're gonna go and then take advantage of this library in here, right? So so we can just destructure this library in here, or you can import HTTP error and do like HTTP errors that not found. It's still that preference is still yours. But in here now we can just come here and say, okay, get create book. Which one were we dealing with? Get one book, right? So instead of throwing like the native error object, we can instead throw not a new instance of not found, right? And now I'm doing this not found by default. Let's see if to be sure I imported this correctly. Yeah, it's supposed to be not found, I think. Okay. Let's just to be sure. I'm not sure of the correct not found. Let's see. Yep. All right. And you're not found, right? So if we go back to let's go to the MDN docs for let's HTTP uh, response status codes, right? Yep. Go to so in the range of the this is from the client, right? So bad requests for example, you can see this. So you give a 400, like which is a bad request, which is a 400, right? So for example, in the case of where we give like a uh, bad like object ID, right? That's something from wherever is querying our API. They give us a bad object ID, right? So in the case of 401, right? So this person was not is unauthorized to access, and we'll get to that, right? So there's forbidden, right? So in this case, for example, that resource, this we deleted that particular document from the database, right? So now you're trying to query for that document, it doesn't exist, right? So basically it's not found, right? All right, so back in here, so we throw a new error that says new not found, right? And so now it would resolve to a 404, and the actual error object that we threw would have like a status code of 404 with the message of notebook with this ID found, right? So now if we send it again, you can see now it says 404 not found, right? And we can use this now, we can use the same pattern throughout our application and make our life easier. All right. So we've handled for get books. We've done for our get one book, and we've gone for create book, right? All right. So we've done for get books, right? We've done for get one book, right? And then we're gonna do okay update book. So another thing about this find by ID and update function you need to know is, right, by default uh, this returns a document, but I think it doesn't return like the new document. It returns like the existing document, right? So actually, so we actually have to test all the API. So we've done create books, get all books, get a single book, and then the next one is create books, get one book. So yeah, update book. All right. So update, we're gonna send like a patch request, right? So we're just gonna say add request, right? So say update a book, right? All right. So same thing we've been doing here. I'm just gonna take this. You're gonna because for you to be able for you to update a book, like you need the particular ID of that book you want to update, right? And we wrote like the route for this like in the previous class. All right. So you send like a patch request, right? This time you send like a patch request of the book you want to update, right? All right. And then in the body you put like the particular data you want to update, right? So all right, so let's say we want to update the name from we want to update like the author to something. So let's say we want to update the author to something Shalom. I don't know, Shalom Iteka, right? So we gave it like an original author of like Chimamanda Adichie. Now we want to update like the author to Shalom Iteka, right? So we would send like a patch request, right? So in our case now, if you look at this is what's gonna happen. This gives a success true, but remember we deleted this thing from the database, so we are not correctly handling all our errors, right? So the first thing for us to update a book, we need to first check does that book even exist in the first place, right? Uh, so we would say we will call this book, right? Because you can update something that doesn't exist, right? So we'll say find by ID, right? Because remember we have like the ID in the request parameter, right? So request dot params dot ID, right? All right. So and all right, all right. So now we can now easily check now if not book, right? Because if we don't find this thing is gonna be null, right? we're not gonna get like anything inside. We're not gonna get anything inside here. We can throw like a throw new not found, right? Let's say no book with this ID exists right now. The person that's trying to query our database will know, okay, this book I'm trying to update doesn't exist. So if we send an so what was that? Yep, that's my bad. So this is gonna be book that's find by ID. All right, that's my bad. All right. So when we hit here right now, so right, tells us like no book with this ID exists, right? So we're trying to this, and you see it gives us like a not found. So we have like this middleware managing everything for us, and we don't have to be like very specific with the response, right? We just need to throw the right error, and then the middleware handles formatting like the message and the right status code for us. Okay, so now you can update a book that doesn't exist, right? All right. So and then the next thing we're gonna do is uh we can now do this and say or for example, we actually, to even make this more descriptive, we can call this, for example, we can call this existing book, right? Because our book exists or something, right? So if not existing book, right, or like you can update a book that doesn't exist, right? If not existing book, right? I think that's not the right calling of existing. Yeah, that's not right for that existing. If not existing book, right? Through an error, right? So now we're gonna call this the book we wanna, well, let's just call this the book we wanna update, right? So in here, so this thing takes a couple of an option object. So if you hover around this, so you give like the thing, the document you're trying to like update, right? So actually let's just go to the documentation, right? Let's say mongoose find by ID and update, right? All right. So so just come here. I'm gonna search find by ID and update. Yep. Right. So it takes in like the ID we want to update. We want to of the particular document we want to update, right? It takes in an object of the values we want to update, right? And then it takes in like an options, right? So in this option, for example, if we parse in like a lane, right? So I always like using this because this uh but we will get to that later. But this thing, lane, is a thing that just sometimes, so when you have a model is like a full like mongoose object. Sometimes you just want to return like a plain JavaScript object in that case, because we're not doing anything with the object, we're just returning it to the client, right? So we would go we will talk about that, right? So it takes in like a couple of uh other of options, right? So you can parse in like new. So new is a boolean, that returns if whether you want to. So if you call the find by ID, by default it will return you like the first document, not the new. So we can actually, it's easier to demonstrate than explain. So let's just console the logbook right now, right? let's console the logbook. So let's go to our API and get all books, right? So this is like one of the reasons like it's very nice for you to so you see like we don't have to like go and start we don't have to go and start all right. So we're gonna change this to Shalom Iteka, right? We're gonna just copy this ID because we already deleted this one, so we can update something that's been deleted. We're gonna use this ID, right? So now if we send a request, right, and let's come to like the the what when we console the logbook, it gives us a reporter, right? Instead of the new, we updated the name to show it author should be Shalom Iteka, right? If you see what's in the it gives us like Harry Potter, right? So if we pass in a couple of arguments in here, for example, we say new equals to true, right? This would rather return the updated document. So we can test this because now this particular document, right? So we can is the author is now Shalom Iteka, right? And we can test this first by going take the same ID and get one book, right? So we can come here and we can just paste this ID here, right? We can paste this ID here and say send like a request, right? The author is Shalom Iteka instead of what did we have before? We had yeah, author who knows. Now we've updated the author to be Shalom Iteka, right? So now if we want to if we run an update, we want to return like the new thing, not the old one, right? So if we change this to Shalom, I don't know, Shalom Espoir, for example, change this to Shalom Espoir, right? And then we say we change this to Shalom Espoir, and after passing in new true, right? This will return this will return us like and we should have so this will return us instead of now this will return us like the new updated one, right? Instead of like the old one, right? So and we can test this out and send the request again. All right, so now it gives us Shalom Espoir, and that is what we want. We want to see the updated document, not the old one. All right, so yeah, so I hope we've covered like the we've covered that, right? All right, so we've covered error handling. So same thing, if you can also in here if you want to in here same thing, we can also we've done for delete now. So the next thing on the agenda we're going to talk about, and I think I'm just going to break that the second thing into a separate video because I feel like this has been going very long. So in the next video I'm going to talk about like just one. So you see how we were able to like abstract our error handling into a middleware, and we didn't have to like repeat ourselves all the time again, right? Instead of doing like rest this and handling like the errors in the catch block, right? So we're going to replicate like the same kind of thing, but now for like asynchronous, because if you kind of look at this, right, we are repeating ourselves here, right? We have a try and catch, we have a try and catch, we have a try and catch all over in here, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing, but yeah. So the next video is going to talk about that, so I'm going to break that into a separate video and we'll treat that separately.